how does a nation really become what it is today? It's rarely just one big event. It's usually a series of flashpoints, these critical moments where everything changes. Today, we're going to dive deep into 4 of these pivotal moments that really pull back the curtain on the complex and absolutely fascinating history of Brazil.
So, let's start with a wild question. What happens when a colony, the place that's supposed to be on the fringes, suddenly becomes the very center of the empire? And this isn't just a thought experiment, it actually happened. And it sets the stage for our first dramatic turning point, a moment that would forever alter the destiny of not one, but 2 continents. All right, let's get into it.
Here's our game plan for today. We're kicking things off with the absolutely shocking story of the Portuguese crown moving to the tropics. Then we'll look at how a brutal war nearly broke the brand new empire. From there, we'll jump ahead to the 1930s and Brazil's brush with fascism. And we'll wrap up by seeing how Brazil carved its own path through the Cold War.
Okay, our first moment is really a story of survival and total reinvention. We're in the early 1800s. Europe is an absolute mess thanks to Napoleon. And for the Portuguese Empire, the only way out was to make a move so radical, nobody saw it coming.
I mean, just try to imagine the sheer audacity of this. The Portuguese government was stuck between a rock and a hard place. Napoleon's France on one side and its old ally Great Britain on the other. With Napoleon's army practically at the gates of Lisbon, the Prince Regent, de Juan, made a decision that was just unheard of. He didn't just run, he packed up the entire state. We're talking the treasury, the royal library, thousands of nobles, the whole shebang, and moved the entire capital of the Portuguese Empire from Lisbon all the way to Rio de Janeiro.
So what happens when the entire royal court just lands in a colony? Well, it stops being a colony. Overnight. This whole process was called the interiorization of the metropolis, which is a fancy way of saying the center of power moved inward to Brazil. They didn't just rule from Brazil, they rebuilt the entire state in Brazil. We're talking new courts, a royal treasury, military academies. They set up colleges, art institutes. And here's the kicker, they totally revolutionized the economy, creating the Bank of Brazil, lifting a long-standing ban on manufacturing, and this is huge, opening Brazil's ports to friendly nations. That single act shattered the old restrictive colonial system.
All of this completely changed the political game. By 1815, it was official. Brazil was elevated to a kingdom, making it legally equal to Portugal. But, not everyone was on board. You had Republican uprisings popping up, and back in Portugal, the elites there felt totally left behind, like their kingdom had become a colony of its own former colony. This feeling boiled over into a revolution in Porto in 1820, demanding the king come home. D. João VI eventually did go back, but he left his son D. Pedro in charge in Brazil. And right there, the stage was set. Independence wasn't just possible anymore, it felt inevitable.
So, that brings us to our next moment. After Brazil declared independence in 1822, the new Brazilian Empire, led by its shiny new emperor, Dom Pedro I, was almost immediately thrown into a massive war that would shake the new nation to its core and seriously test the emperor's power.
This quote from a Brazilian deputy in 1827 just perfectly sums up the mood. You can feel the frustration, right? There was real anger brewing in Parliament. People were asking, hey, we were supposed to win this thing, so why is it dragging on, costing a fortune, and getting people killed? And they were starting to point fingers right at the top.
So the whole fight was over a piece of land called the Banda Oriental, which we know today as Uruguay. For centuries, it was this strategic buffer zone that the Spanish and Portuguese empires were always fighting over. D. João VI had made it part of the kingdom back in 1821, so naturally, when Brazil became an empire, it said, yep, that's ours. The problem was, in 1825, separatists there declared they wanted to be part of Argentina, and Argentina said, sounds good to us. To Brazil, that was basically a declaration of war.
And the crucial thing here is how this war just spiraled. Militarily, it was a total stalemate, incredibly bloody and expensive with no clear winner. Diplomatically, Great Britain waded in to help, but their solution wasn't to help Brazil win. It was to create an independent Uruguay as a buffer state. Economically, the war was an absolute catastrophe, completely draining the national treasury. All that financial chaos, mixed with growing anger over D. Pedro I's authoritarian rule, created a perfect political storm. This war was the key thing that destroyed his support and ultimately forced him to give up the throne in 1831.
All right, now we're going to leap forward a full century into the chaos of the 1930s. The whole world was reeling from economic depression and the rise of some pretty scary ideologies, and Brazil was right there in the thick of it.
This period saw the birth of a powerful and very real homegrown fascist movement. I want you to just picture this scene. Sao Paulo, 1934. 40,000 people, all marching in perfect lockstep, wearing green shirts, arms raised in a salute. This wasn't Italy or Germany. This was the Ação Integralista Brasileira, the AIB. And that Greek letter on their armbands, the sigma, it stood for sum, because their goal was to be the total, all-encompassing force in Brazilian society. This was no fringe group. This was a mass movement.
So what did these guys actually believe? Well, Brazilian integralism was a fiercely nationalist and totalitarian ideology. It mostly defined itself by what it was against: liberalism, socialism, and international finance. Those were the big enemies. And its foundation was built on what it considered the core pillars of society: God, country, and family, with a huge emphasis on tradition and the Catholic Church.
Now, integralism didn't just pop up out of nowhere. You have to remember what was happening in the world. The 1929 stock market crash made a lot of people lose faith in liberal democracy. Suddenly, movements like fascism in Italy and Nazism in Germany started looking like strong alternatives. And inside Brazil, there was already a growing authoritarian vibe. A lot of people believed that the country needed a strong, centralized government to move forward, and that created the perfect breeding ground for the AIB. And this is where the story takes a dramatic turn. The integralists decided to back an ambitious politician named Getúlio Vargas, thinking he'd give them a seat at the table. But Vargas was playing a completely different game. In 1937, he staged a coup, created his own dictatorship called the Estado Novo. And then, in a stunning move, he banned all political parties, including the integralists who had just helped him get there. Feeling totally betrayed, the AIB tried to fight back with an uprising in 1938. It was crushed, the movement was basically wiped out, and its leader was sent into exile. For our final moment, we're heading into the 1960s, a world sliced right down the middle by the Cold War. In this incredibly high-stakes game of superpowers, Brazil tried to do something really different. It tried to carve out a third path, a path of independence that would put it on a collision course with the United States.
So the scene is this massive meeting of the Organization of American States, the OEA, in 1962. And the #1 topic on the agenda? Fidel Castro's Cuba. After the Cuban Revolution went full-on Marxist-Leninist and allied with the Soviet Union, the U.S. saw it as a massive threat in its backyard and wanted every country in the hemisphere to fall in line against it. But Brazil wasn't playing by the usual Cold War rules. It had its own playbook, called the Independent Foreign Policy. The whole idea was to avoid getting locked into one side or the other. Brazil wanted the freedom to trade with and talk to any nation, capitalist or communist, based on what was best for Brazil, not what Washington or Moscow wanted. And this is where things got really tense. On one side, you had the U.S. position, which was crystal clear. Cuba is a threat, and it needs to be punished with sanctions and kicked out of the OEA right now. But Brazil's position was much more complicated. They argued that, yeah, foreign interference in the Americas is bad, but a country has the right to choose its own path. They believed that punishing Cuba and isolating it would just be counterproductive and push it even deeper into the Soviet camp.
So what happened when it came time to vote? Brazil abstained. And it wasn't the only one. Other big Latin American countries did the same. It was this clear, powerful statement. It was Brazil sticking to its independent foreign policy, refusing to just be a rubber stamp for Washington, even with all that Cold War pressure.
So, we've walked through these 4 really different moments: a royal court on the run, a disastrous war, a fascist march, and a diplomatic standoff. What's the common thread that ties all of these stories together?
The big takeaway is this: you just can't understand Brazil's story by only looking inside its borders. Its entire history has been shaped by this constant, intense tug-of-war between its own internal dramas and these huge forces from the outside world. The Napoleonic Wars literally created the modern Brazilian state. A regional war sparked its first major political crisis. Global ideologies fueled its most extreme political movements. And the Cold War put its national sovereignty to the ultimate test.
And it all leaves us with a bigger question, doesn't it? These 4 snapshots tell us so much about one country's journey. And it makes you wonder, what are the forgotten turning points, the hidden connections that have shaped the history of every nation on Earth? And how do those stories, those echoes from the past, continue to shape the world that we all share today?